Hey guys, welcome to the first lecture of Humanities 5, Art Appreciation in Art History. We are looking with this lecture just kind of addressing what is art, and a little bit of what we're going to study of it or how we're going to look at it, kind of the key points within it. So of course the first question is, what is art? What makes up art? And it's a hard question. It seems like a simple question. What is art? Being able to define it. How do you define it? But in reality, it is not that simple because there are a lot of components to that question. And so you have, just even in these two pictures here, very different types of art. And that's part of the issue, right, is that there are hundreds of different styles of art, and that evolves and changes over time. We're going to be looking at something in a minute that's, or if we even go back to it, we're going to be looking at what's more traditional art, or is often called fine art. That is another name for it. It also, in the past, has been given the name high art. The thing with the definition of why high art is not used as much anymore is that high art tends to imply that it is the best or superior. It also tended to be connected to social classes, with the idea that only the wealthy produce or can experience high art. So this term is, while occasionally you'll still see it if you're reading up on art and looking at it, it's not used very often. Fine art, even in that name, has some issues. So the easier way of just tagging it, I suppose, or defining it as traditional art. This tends to be what would be older art, things that have been around. Tradition, right, is part of that. Things that have been around for a while. And so they've been solidified into our society and other societies as acceptable art, traditional art, or fine art. We'll look into some more definitions of that when we get to that topic. But that type of art, that's usually more easily definable. If you put up the Mona Lisa and ask someone here, right, this is the Mona Lisa, and you said, hey, is this art? I'd be shocked if anyone said no. They're going to say yes, because this is cemented within that tradition of being acceptable art. But the thing is that even that traditional art is narrow and can be subjective in of itself. But what is art has expanded over time. And not everyone agrees. Art is subjective. And so there isn't a clear-cut agreement that we can say this is art and this is not, right? Even if you just go to this style here, which is abstract art, right? And there are some people who think that abstract art is not real art, or that only certain types of abstract art is real art. And so you have, even with an older abstract art, which is somewhat solidified in that genre, has questions where people will say yes or no. So this if you put this picture up and you said, is this art, you're going to get more of a mixed response of yeses and nos than you will with the Mona Lisa, which is going to have be a yes. And so, like I said, we end up in this predicament of if it's subjective, if it is an evolving definition and understanding, how do you define or decide what is art? Now, one of the things to suggest is that how you decide what is art that's up to the individual. That every individual is going to have a different definition. And that's fine. I think it's important that we just acknowledge that there isn't a clear-cut definition. Now, what I did do is I put up definition for you, just that I think is a good starting point. Again, because it's subjective and because it can't be, clearly defined for the entire world or society or culture. It's always going to be limiting. But so what is a good definition? Because you still want to come up with a definition. You want to have something that you can say, okay, well, in general, this is art, right? Rather than just being like, whatever you want it to be. I mean, because that works, but that's not the answer people want to hear. If someone asks you, what is art? And you just said, who knows, or whatever, that's not going to be a satisfying answer. So here's what I came up with, and that others have come up with as well. And it's kind of a mix of a couple different definitions. Art is the purposeful expression or application of human creative skill or imagination that makes the audience feel something. I think it's important to say human creation, because you can have animals that create things and we don't consider that art. I mean, although some people do, so that gets into some controversy there. In fact, there was the selfie of, I think it was a monkey, that the photographer taught the monkey how to push the button to take a picture, and they ended up taking a selfie. And PETA then sued to say that the monkey should have the copyright, and the courts said no. So at least in terms of law, art has to be human creation. You could get into a larger argument about that with animals and things like that. But according to the law, at least, if the animal doesn't have copyright towards it, then it has to be human creation. So art is the purposeful expression or application of human creative skill or imagination that makes the audience feel something. And I think that's an important part of it too. So art is the purposeful expression. You could argue, what about those accidents with spills that then look like art? Then it's the intent of the person who took the picture to then interpret it as art, and you're still having a human creation of either reproducing it in some form or another. But that it's intentful, it's human creation, and it can be skill, what we would consider, good quality, someone that has a skill in drawing or painting, or imagination, which is where you get into the abstract art part, right? Which maybe doesn't necessarily have the same skill sets as the Mona Lisa, but it is coming out of someone's imagination that makes the audience feel something. Art, and that goes into the next part, right? Art is supposed to make us feel or think, right? That is the kind of the purpose behind it. That art is almost always created by the artist to invoke emotions or thought. That it naturally does. I mean, I can't possibly think of a situation where that isn't a component of it. But even if the artist had no intent of what the art would do, although that could be argued that's impossible. Art makes us feel or think. It invokes emotion or it invokes thought and discussion. It's meant specifically to have expression or relay. Expression or relay of experiences or emotions. So it can also be about the artist's experiences or the person viewing it from one person to another, right? And that one person is the artist and the other person is the viewer, the one that's experiencing it. Art is needs to have intent or a goal. Right, because then one of the questions is, what makes a paper cup not art versus an elaborate vase? Well, the paper cup, right? Well, let's go under this for just a second with that. So if you go with the idea of, okay, is a paper cup, let's ask the question. Didn't want to write there. There we go. Is a paper cup art? And again, I think if you asked anyone, they would just say no. Well, a paper cup, it has a function or a purpose for use, right? It's there to be a disposable drink container. So you have purposeful, I suppose, but it's not meant to have someone feel or think, right? There's no intent of trying to convey or relay emotion, that or a thought or an idea. It's simply a utilitarian thing. So that if you're just making something, or if something's just made for utility, that's not art, right? So there is something, and while art is subjective, I think that's a clear-cut separation. Art that has to have that intent to relay or express emotions or thought provoking to another person. Okay, so and sometimes I guess it could be just for the artist, but a lot of times art's meant to be shared, right? Okay, so that's kind of a clear-cut aspect of that. The other thing you have with this is art versus design, right? Is design art? Yes, design is art, but with a practical purpose. So regular art, if we call it regular, doesn't have to have a practical purpose. Okay, design has a practical purpose. Now here's where you get the elaborate vase or a chair. If a chair is just mass produced to have it be utilitarian, to have utility, then it's not necessarily art. So design, there can be design that isn't necessarily considered art. But when you have design that's meant to express emotion or thought, but it also has a practical purpose, right? So that's the, so a paper cup is not art. It could be a design. It is a design. It had to be designed to be made. So there you go with a paper cup can be design, but not art. However, design can be art. So it just depends on that, right, with it. But the difference between art and design, why we have two different names for them, is art doesn't have to have a practical purpose. The art is for the sake of passing on and presenting emotions and feelings and thinking and thoughts. Design has that component. When it's art, when design is art, it has the component of art, but it also has a practical purpose. And that practical purpose is on emotion. It also has, where it can build sympathy and empathy and understanding for a cause or issue. So it uses, we'll say, emotions to create understanding, which can be, again, sympathy or empathy for a cause or issue. Or an experience. So this is where you get like advertisements, can be art, often are art, but they are also design. and they are specifically trying to create a specific emotion. You can have other ones that are meant to evoke, like I said, understanding or empathy, or it can be thought-provoking and are meant to create a feeling. But the emotion's the key part there. Even when something's thought-provoking, it usually is connected to a visceral feeling with emotion. And that's a kind of a part of that. Okay, and then we have performance art. So performance art it's different. So performance art is like a play, right? Or it can also be something that's set up in an art gallery that isn't a play, but that someone is doing. It usually has motion to it. Performance art has to have some kind of motion evolved in it. So we'll add that part right with it. That motion is a part of it, a component of performance art. Okay, and then the other part is that performance art is an expression of art. You have in performance art someone expressing the art. And they can do that by, like I said, a play, by speaking, by dancing, versus a creative artist, right, is someone who made the art. So a person performing art doesn't necessarily have to be the person who created it. Sometimes it can be both. So performance art can be both, right? You can have the person that created the performance art and then also perform it. So that's performance art. So you kind of get this idea of what is art. Well, we have that definition. Art is art. This leads to this thing of, you have that definition with art, but art is art. It is subjective. It can also, you can't say, well, we'll go with that one first. You can't say something is not art. In terms of, because of quality. So because of quality, right? Technically, like I said, I can say, well, paper cup is not art. However, could be a paper cup that was art. It again goes back to the intent. So if you know the intent, then you can say it. But it's hard to say something is not art. What this means then is that there can be, don't click off of that. There can be bad art, right? If we go back to the PowerPoint for just a second here, right? Is bad art considered art? Yes. You may, say it's not good art, and someone else may say, I think that's the best picture of a cat I've ever seen, because it is subjective. But just because something is bad doesn't mean it's not art. But it for like most of the population, it still could be considered bad art. Right now, where might bad art not be considered art? Well, here's an example. This was a story a little while ago of this fresco, and this is the original. Okay, and then this was just it had deteriorated over time. So over time, it had lost color, and well, mostly just the color, right? It was starting to peel and stuff, and so they wanted to restore it. So restoration is something different. Restoring it is meant to make it go back to the original. right? That's the goal. You're not creating something different. Now, you could argue that restoration is an art in terms of a craft or skill. But it's not the same thing as creating your own art. You're trying to restore something is you're simply trying to put it back to the way it was by the original artist. You're trying to keep, this goes back right to that of the intent of original artist. But what happened is this woman that was part of the church, this was her restoration. And there was debate about whether the church knew she was doing this or not. She claimed that they gave her the go-ahead. They claimed they didn't. Either way, what you got was considered this horrible restoration, which completely destroyed. I mean, look at the difference in face here versus here, right? She got rid of all of the depth and character of the face with this restoration. And so in this, you could argue that this is well, one, you could argue it's not even art, it's a restoration. But you could also argue that this, because it's not, because it was a restoration and it was supposed to be there, that when her intent was not to create this, but to create this, that it wasn't art. Or you could argue that it evolved into its own art, right? So here's again, that's the issue of subjectivism. So we're not going to be in this class debating and looking at art and saying, is this art? Is this not art? I think it's important to address at the beginning because it's a question that a lot of people have. We're instead going to be looking at the types of art, and first we're going to actually be looking at the fundamentals. And because the fundamentals are the building blocks of art. All art has various components of the fundamentals we're going to look at. And if you want to understand art, be able to analyze it, or just appreciate everything around you, because we are surrounded by art in our day-to-day life, you need to know the fundamentals. And then the second half of the class will be looking at more the history of art, which is looking at different cultures like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, Africa, the Americas, and looking at the art that was produced at that time and why. What did it represent? Why was this the type of art that they were creating? How does it connect to their culture? So you have kind of two different periods of this class, the fundamentals and then the history of art, or the cultures, different cultures and their art. Okay, so let me just finish off this last part here. So there can be bad art, right? But it still is considered art, right? Because it is subjective. One of the ways, if you're trying to define or say, is this art, is there were 3 questions that Van Gogh came up with. And what he said was to determine if something is art, right? Or good art, more than if it's art. So these 3 questions, is it good art? Right? Because it is subjective. What was the goal? Right? Why did the artist create that art? What was the purpose? Did they achieve that goal? Okay, so that's, did they accomplish what they were trying to do? And then, was it worth doing? And if you can answer these questions in the affirmative, well, what is the goal is more specific. But if you can establish what is the goal, did they achieve it, was it worth doing? And again, was it worth doing, not necessarily in your view of if something is worth doing, but was it worth doing in trying to achieve that goal? If those last 2 answers are yes, then it's art, and it's good art, even if it's not art that you think is good. right? So again, that we're getting into, kind of really philosophical aspects of aesthetics and what is art. But it's super interesting to look at around you. And I'd say, as an activity, is, think about your day and try to come up with a list of everything that you interact with that's art. And we might make this an activity for us to do, because it is, you should be surprised by how long that list actually is, because we are constantly surrounded by art, and a lot of the times we don't even think about it. So there's definitely art that makes you stop and think and be aware of that. And by that definition alone, if art stops and make you go, wow, that's cool, that's really good art, for you. But we are inundated with art in so many ways. So what we're going to look at are the categories of art, and we're going to explore these in class within the fundamentals, and we'll also kind of they'll come in and out of the history of art when we look at specific artwork for various cultures. So the first one I already mentioned, which is fine art, or that's also, right, traditional art. Okay, so this tends to be, as I put on the PowerPoint, older or established art forms. Art styles that have been around for quite a while, that it makes the older styles tend to make people more comfortable in saying, yeah, this is acceptable art. This usually includes painting. Here, we'll just do it like that: painting, drawing, sculpture, and sometimes print. And sometimes print, specifically here, is going to be like illuminated manuscripts. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. So these fine art tends to then be defined that it's made with skill, so that you can say that person knows what they're doing, and is meant to be pleasing to the eye. Right, so it's not meant to be, there is what's called kind of distorted perspective, distorted proportions, and that's meant to actually make things look wrong. So when you look at it, you're like, oh, what's wrong with their proportions of their body? And that can just be a lack of skill. But there is also a genre of it, if you will, of artists that they intentionally do that to draw your attention. But that then doesn't fall under fine art, usually. Okay, so that's fine art. And then we're going to go through these, and then I'll show you the pictures for them. So then you have graphic art. And graphic art, this is often, so graphic art is a newer type of art. Well, so we'll put newer here. Because what graphic art is defined with is that it's made by a method that can be reproduced. And the ability, usually by a machine. Right, so not reproduced with multiple copies of the same image. Right, so not just reproduced in that the artist just repaints it multiple times, but that there's different machines that can reproduce it. The printing press, well, actually, you have woodblock painting and linoleum carving. So you have wood that they would carve out the art, and then you would roll it in ink and then put the paper on it. So it's like a stamp. And there's different mediums to do that, which is usually called print art. And that is one way that's one of the oldest for reproducing the same image over and over again. But then, of course, you have like advertisements and other graphic art that's done on the computer, and you buy a poster of it. That's often graphic art, and specifically that it's meant to be reproduced. We have reproductions of the Mona Lisa, but it's not the same thing as the original. if you have a poster of something that was made on the computer of graphic art, it was meant to be in that mode and reproduced multiple times. It has historically been considered less important than fine art. So, we're not going to rank the importance, but if you're looking at like traditionally how art has been seen, one, because it's newer, it's seen as a lower medium than others. This is then what is graphic art, right? So you have media, books, magazines, can all be graphic art, posters, advertisements, right? I think a lot of times we don't think about ads as art, but they often can be. Signs, television, right? A TV show could be art, or movies, computers, screens, and social media, right? So when I mentioned that art is all around you, now it doesn't mean everything with social media is art, but the design and structure can be in that. So you have graphic art. What's graphic design? Because it's a slightly different name, right? Well, graphic design tends to be something that's commercial art. So advertisements and stuff can fall under graphic design rather than just graphic art. And it's commercial art, which is the goal is communication. So again, in advertisements, while it can be graphic art, it's also sometimes called graphic design. And then we have performance art, right, which I mentioned, which can be plays, dance, the circus is a type of performance art, videos. Actors are part of a performance artist, right? And you can also have shows, which we'll put not like TV shows, but where you have an artist that is putting on a show and they're in this space and they're doing something intentful with motion. As I mentioned, performance art is connected to the idea of motion. You kind of have to have motion to be a performance. If there's no motion, it's less likely a performance. It also can be live or recorded, but again, it's that act of having this means that there's change. The other thing that goes with it is that it often, again, if it's recorded, it's reproduced. But the idea is that it takes up a space and time. So you go watch a play, right? And it starts and it finishes, and then that performance art is over. Even if you go to the play again, it's technically experienced slightly differently. And so it's done in a specific space and time. Okay, so that's that. Let's look at that, and then we'll look at just like the key components of studying art, and then that will be it for today. Wrong thing. There we go. Okay, let's minimize this for now. So if we're looking at art, right? Here's traditional art. Starry Night. This is Da Vinci. Right, with drawing. We had painting and then drawing. This is Japanese art, very famous one. And here's the illuminated manuscript. And the illuminated manuscripts grew very popular in the Middle Ages, and we're going to look at them more. They're, like, to me, this is one of the most impressive things because of the amount of effort it took to make these, and they can be so elaborate. And so this is when I talked about with traditional art, where print sometimes is considered traditional or fine art. Illuminated manuscripts fall into that category. Calligraphy also falls into that category. And then sculptures, Greek sculptures, Roman sculptures, definitely part of that fine art. And then you have graphic art. So here's an example of graphic art, right? It's something that's meant to be reproduced, that isn't, for a lot of times graphic art now, right, that's connected to the computer. It's done on the computer. That's the easy way of looking at it is, was this done on the computer? Now, someone can paint in a style that looks like graphic art, but that kind of falls in between then. It's not traditional art. It's not technically graphic art, but it's art in the style of graphic art. Here's another one, it's printmaking. So like if you're doing printmaking for t-shirts or posters, that's all graphic art. Here's another one, digital art, which I didn't put that as a title, but graphic art is often digital art these days. But that, again, that's a really new thing. The ability to do art on the computer is new. They did art where people would draw and then you would, with the printing press, replicate that. But the original was drawn. Now you have art that's drawn, but it's on the computer. And then you have other art that can be graphic art or design. And especially this is where design comes in, where it's all done with the computer and someone didn't draw it at all. So like this was digitally done. Someone on like with me drawing here, right, was drawing out on the computer these birds. And so they went and did on their computer, and they started doing that, right? my birds. Anyways, this is done digitally, digital art. But they drew it versus using a program where you make shapes or right, design. If we're putting it there, I didn't give an example of that. Text. So in advertisements and in even just like promotional like material that you send out to someone, you have the different types of fonts that are important because different fonts produce different emotions and feelings when you look at them. And that is definitely more graphic design, right? Because there isn't something being drawn out and it's more text than anything else, versus when you have these ones I showed you, which are graphic art because it's very much drawn and created, versus designing that. Design could also be products, right? So it doesn't have to just be on paper. Phone cases. Apple goes through hundreds of designs to create the perfect phone case that evokes certain feeling and emotion when you open it and look at it. Simplicity is a part of that, right? I should have put some of those pictures in. So product cases, right? That's design. Cereal boxes, that's graphic design. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between graphic art and graphic design. Advertisements as art, right? So here you have Heinz ketchup, but it's this very creative design to kind of create an artistic feel, but it has an intent and purpose to get you to purchase it, right? But advertisements can very much be art. And in fact, the best advertisements tend to be art because the whole point is to create and invoke, an emotion to get you to purchase the product. Right? That's their end goal. The more visceral emotion that they can create when you look at an ad, the more likely you are to buy it. And I am a sucker for design in tech, but also wrapping. Like if you create a product that has a really cool case or wrapping, I want that product, and I know I'm a sucker for it. And I'm like, I don't need that. I don't even think I'll use it, but it's such cool design of whatever they put it in, that definitely draws me, right? And so that is an important element. The better the design, the more likely you're going to get someone to want to purchase it. The better with ads, the more emotion you can create in it, the more likely someone's going to have an emotional connection to that and then want it. And not only want it, but almost feel. The whole goal of ads is to create a want and make it you think in your head that you need it, right? Oh, I need to have that. And and obviously we're being facetious in the need a bit, but that emotional creates that connection. Color, and we're going to look at color theory. Color also plays a role in emotion. So there is a reason that they chose green here, because green is connected to the earth, to recycling, to the planet, to health, in terms of not, I mean, if you saw a person with green, it's the opposite, then they're sick. But it's life, right? Because of trees and everything else. So a leaf is green, but they also chose green because a green leaf is alive versus a brown leaf that's dead. And so every leaf traps CO2s, plant for the planet. So they're trying to get people to either give them money for planting trees, donate trees. So yeah, give them money to donate trees for them to plant. And so, you're right, this is meant to create that's really cool looking. And now I also have an emotional connection to this of saving the planet, and I'm going to go donate. So we'll look at color theory too, which is really fascinating for how color and psychology, theory or color psychology, it's both, plays a role in art. And that, like, just stuff you don't even think about, right? And why are we learning about these fundamentals, which color is one of them? Because there's all these things and components that go into art that if when you know, it helps you understand the art. It also helps you understand tactics that are being used in trying to sucker you into something, right? If you know that, you're going to be more prepared. Street art and design, right? So you have spray painting, and whether like some questions of like tagging, which this is tagging, right? Is that art? Versus this more intentful design. Now, why it's not just street art, but also design, is because this is trying to make a statement, where you can say a political statement, a social, so we'll say a social and political statement, right? And they're using this design to do this. Is about capitalism. This is Banksy. And he usually often has a point, a statement behind his art. So here you have street art as art and design. Here, controversial art, right? This happened not too long ago. This was in an art gallery, and it was a banana with duct tape on a wall. And many people saying, that's not art. How can that be art? And then apparently the gallery was just supposed to replace the banana when it got too brown. And then the film, there's a film, I should have put that in with it, of a guy who went up, and they were selling it for some crazy price. Probably not thinking anyone would actually ever buy it. They were making more of a statement about what is art. Like that, this was part of that. There was no way that the person who did this was like, oh yeah, someone's going to buy this banana that's going to rot in a few days. And it was making a statement about what is art, right? So even artists discuss what is art. But then a guy in the gallery went up and ate the banana in front of everyone, and they were filming it, and he said, oh, they're like, you've just destroyed this thing. Whether or not anyone thought it was actual art, like that, are you going to pay for that kind of thing? And he goes, oh, it's performance art. That was his argument, right? I'm now doing something in the act of performance art to the art itself. I'll link the video on Canvas for you. And then of course more traditional performance art of like dancing. I was trying to combine ballet and dancing together. Ballet, dancing, that plays and things like that. And then you have interactive art, which is a form of performance art. But the difference here is that performance, it's a variation of performance art because it's performance art with the, we'll say, viewer as the performer, right? So usually performance art is the performer, right, is not, we'll say, the consumer or viewer, right? So someone who goes to the play is not the performance artist. Those are the people doing the play. Interactive art makes you, the viewer, part of the performance art. and it creates a tactile sense off into that. So here you have with it having the multicolors. This one was they had people come participate and type words on the typewriter with this continuously long piece of paper. And so then the art is not only in the words, but in how the paper stacks up. And everyone that came and participated ends up being a part of that art. So interactive art can be really cool in that sense. So what are the fundamentals of art? Right? Why are we studying that part of it too, in that importance? But before we get to that last part here, let's just look at kind of here studying art, and what does that mean? And what are we going to be doing? So in studying art, there's a couple different ones. The first part is content. And in content, it is subject matter, but it's rarely just about the subject matter of identifying, right? That subject matter is identifying what is it about, which is important. You know, what is it about, or what is the purpose? You do want to know those things if you're trying to understand any type of art. You need to kind of, I guess you don't need to know those things, but the likelihood of being able to appreciate and understand the art goes down significantly if you don't. Content, let me make the T there, it helps create underlying meaning, or understand the underlying meaning behind it, right? So in order to understand, let's say to understand the content, to understand and be like, okay, you know, what is this about? What can be helpful is, right, I wrote the one right there, identify the subject. What is it about? Right? Then it also, the context in which it was made. So that could be a couple different things, which is, what was the purpose? When was it made? You know, why was it made? All of those things. Who was the artist, right? That stuff can help with that. And then formal analysis, which is going to be the fundamentals that we're going to look at. Being able to understand how they used lines or shape or perspective helps immensely in being able to understand the art. And I know that, like I said, we'll talk about fundamentals more, that it can sometimes seem like the boring part of it. But it's, again, there's so much that you end up realizing that's going into art, and again, into advertisements, into social media, into everything around you. You're like, oh, wow, they actually were using these things intentfully to express this emotion or this idea, or get you to feel something. And it's easy to not know those things if you don't know the formal analysis of it as well. The second goes in more specifically into the subject matter, right? So content is in part understanding the subject, but the subject matter in itself is important because, one, it provides, just knowing the subject matter from the start, it provides a starting point, understanding the artwork. Again, it's much harder to understand the meaning of the art or any type of intrinsic value of good or bad if you don't know what they were doing, right? What is this supposed to be about, or what is it supposed to be? Right? You can't understand the content very well if you don't understand or know the subject matter. You know, and of course, you can know the subject matter sometimes because it's told in the description. You know, art of girl swinging on tree. Okay, well, now I know the subject matter. It was told to me. But a lot of time you look at art around you and it's not given to you so explicitly. And I guess there's kind of three types, right? Is you have what's called representational. And representational just means that it depicts objects or people so that we can recognize it, right? So objects or people are recognizable. You are, we'll say, easy to recognize. It's the idea that you can look at and go, oh, that's of a girl, that's of a tree, that's of whatever. And then you have non-objective. And this is anything that depicts a subject that is not easy to recognize, or not recognizable at all, right? So it can, abstract art is part of that as well. And then you have abstraction, which is not necessarily abstract art, but the this is between, we'll say, between representational and abstraction. Okay, so it's somewhere between, where maybe it's slightly recognizable, but it's not clear-cut and defined. Okay, and then you have context. Context is super important, I think, in part that's because I also teach history. And so I kind of, this is emphasized in my view, but this is understanding the history of the culture and society, right? The time period is with the history. When was it done? What is the culture and society? What was the religion and economics? All of these things from the time period, the history of it, information about the artist. These things all help you understand the art better, because it's going to give you a perspective of like, why might that be important to that society? For example, the color red is super important in China. So when you then look at stuff from China and you see that there's this red in a lot of the art, and you understand why, which we will look at, it helps you understand the art better. If you understand like who were the rulers in China, or what were important views of China or Mesopotamia, how was kingship shown in Mesopotamia versus how was kingship or the pharaoh shown in Egypt, and why were they done in art so differently? Well, in order to understand why Egypt portrays the pharaohs in a certain way that's very different from the Mesopotamians, you have to understand their history and their culture of how kings were viewed and seen in those societies. And once you understand that, you understand why Egyptian pharaohs are massive and extremely what's called hierarchical proportion, very, very large compared to everyone else, and in certain poses that are very rigid, versus in Mesopotamia, they didn't do hierarchical proportion very often, and there were a lot more components to how they showed kings. And then the last thing, and this is the last thing I promise, formal analysis. Okay, and formal analysis is the fundamentals. And we say, let's look at the fundamentals here with that. And so we're gonna learn the fundamentals first. Here are the fundamentals, and then I'll just say the last thing about that. Okay, there we go. Went too far. There's 20 fundamentals that we're looking at. There's 10 that are considered elements, and then 10 that are considered principles. For the elements: line, shape, color, form, mass, motion and time, space, texture, value, and volume. And then for principles: balance, contrast, emphasis, focal point and pattern, proportion, rhythm, scale, unity, and variety. So that's a lot. And again, this is often sometimes called the boring part of art. And I get it, because you're not necessarily, we're going to look at different pieces, but we're also just going to look at the concepts and what they are. but they're important, and hopefully we're going to be doing activities with them that it gives you a new perspective on it, so that it's not just like, oh, we're just talking about a bunch of lines, but that I'm going to be having you do something that's connected to, well, when we talk about lines, you're going to be doing something with lines so that you can see how that's being used. So that, again, hopefully it's not just like, well, here's a definition and then we're moving on to another definition. We're going to talk about what they are, which is kind of that definition, but then we're going to do something to showcase how it's used or how you can see it, and we're going to be looking at specific artwork with each of these to see how that's used in art. So why are fundamentals important? Because, as I mentioned, it's in everything. Now, not all 20 of these fundamentals are in every single artwork, but art cannot exist without using multiple fundamentals. Rarely is it just one fundamental. Almost always by using one fundamental, it creates another. You cannot make art without the fundamentals. And a lot of times artists use these fundamentals on purpose to express and communicate with the person viewing. Again, color, which is one of the elements here, right? There's a whole color psychology, and color psychology that's specifically used to evoke emotion and feeling and that you subconsciously have with colors. We subconsciously have connection to what each color represents. And so advertising especially does this, but artists that are just painting things will pick specific colors to express emotion as well. And so that you understanding that you might be being manipulated emotionally by an artist, by what color they're choosing, by how they're using lines, by how they're using proportion, by how they're using scale, or even focal point, that contrast, all these things. The artists use these to, in a reality, not always nefariously, but manipulate how you perceive what they are producing. And so understanding how, what focal point is, what proportion is, what is the color psychology, by understanding those things, then you can look at an artwork and be like, oh, I see what they're doing there. They totally use contrast here to emphasize this, or created focal point, subordination, which is part of focal point, so that I would look over here first, but the main point of the picture is actually in a different place, right? So they can use focal point to draw your attention because that's where they want you to look, or they can use a subordinate focal point to get you to look somewhere else, but that's not the main point of the picture, right? And so it's super clever, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't understand the fundamentals. So we have to look at the fundamentals first because they are super important. And it will help you be either if you are an artist and you like to do graphic design, comics, traditional, drawing, painting, sculpting. If you like to doodle, if you like to do any of that, or even make apps and games, you'll be a better artist by understanding these. And if you're not an artist in any of those ways, which most people are an artist in some aspect, but if you're not, where you see yourself as, I'm not an artist in any of those ways. I'm not going to create apps. I'm not designing anything. I'm not creating any design on my computer. I'm not drawing or painting or whatever. Just, it helps you be a better viewer of art. It helps you be more aware of your surroundings in life, because we are bombarded by art all the time. Some just for the sake of art, for emotional feelings. Some to make you think, to change your perspective, to get you to purchase something. And you will recognize what they're doing by knowing these things, as well as appreciating other art when you go to a museum or you're walking around somewhere where there's a historical building, and look at that and go, oh, that is doing this, and that's why this looks so cool. It's why I'm drawn to it. Or they created this to specifically get me to look at that and look up to be in awe of the size of that sculpture or building or whatever. So it really does, the fundamentals, again, as much as I know people groan about it when we talk about them at first, I hope that you'll actually find interest in this, and I will try to make it interesting as possible. But that also just recognize the importance of it, that there is a reason to look at these, even if you don't think you're ever going to be an artist in any way, shape, or form, although I would argue that almost everyone is in some way. But even if you're like, nope, never going to be an artist in any of these ways, I only do math. But even math, we could argue, but that's another story. But the point is, right, even if that, just why these are important for your daily life and better understanding the world around you and how people present things is an important reason enough to do it. And then, of course, like I said, when we get into the history of art, it's important for understanding the peoples. What did people from, the beginning of civilization create? And what was important to them? And how did they create it, right? That stuff is really interesting to think about, that the earliest human beings were creating art. We are an artistic species. It's just part of our nature. We're drawn to it either in producing it or viewing it. We like the visual component. We're not just verbal. We are a visual component people as well. Okay, that's where I'm ending. I know that these are kind of long, but it's always like if we were in a class that that just has going to be. I am going to try, because this is an introduction. There was a lot to cover, to do kind of a series of shorter videos. But this is a good practice, right? In college, you are expected with certain professors. There are certain professors that lecture the whole class period. If we were physically in class, I'd be lecturing, we'd be stopping and doing an activity. A lecturer, we'd stop and do an activity. But the reality is that in a college course, you have to also be able to focus and listen to a longer lecture. So just know that there are going to be some shorter lectures, I promise, but there are going to be longer lectures as well, especially as we get into the history part of it, because there's just so much to cover. There's no way to break it up. But for the fundamentals, I am going to try to create a series of shorter videos that then are broken up by activities that you do. But it's good practice to know, like I said, this is an expectation as a college student that you can get through these. And that, as I mentioned, it is important that you do, because your exams will clearly not go well if you aren't listening to these, because the test questions are based on lecture. So please keep that in mind. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Otherwise, that's it. We'll be looking at lines in the next lecture.